Okay, Rabbi, are you ready for the Purim reality show? I hope you all took Ubers here tonight. You have to finish these bottles before we leave. No? The class is called Getting Wasted. Oh, you want to take a rain check for Tuesday? You think you're supposed to get wasted on Tuesday?
What's that?
Do you think you're supposed to get wasted on Tuesday?
Wasted? I don't know.
No, that's what we're here to find out tonight, my friends. Because we're going to begin with some very interesting Gemara. And then we'll try to get to the bottom of this. We will try very hard to get to the bottom of this story. Are we supposed to get wasted on Purim? That is the theme for tonight's class. And this is yet another episode in our Customs and Convention series. By the way, if these bottles are getting in your way, you can take them away. It was just a joke. It might be getting in my way, actually. Yeah. I'm thinking that might be easier without the bottles here. Okay. The props have served their purpose. Eliezer, feel free if you want to, spruce it up. No problem.
You want to move this?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah. Thank you. It's heavy. Careful.
No, because see, you take right from the bottom.
Okay, good. I'm glad I got everybody to laugh, and life is fantastic. We are going to be opening tonight's class in Masechet Megillah. Before I begin, I want to gratefully acknowledge the sponsorship for tonight for Eliezer and Esther Sheffer, who are dedicating this class in the memory of their son Aryeh ben Eliezer Esther, who tragically was taken from us before his time. And his neshama should have an aliyah. I'm sure he's getting a kick out of all the booze on the table now as he looks down from Gan Eden and he hears you wanting to get wasted, Eliezer. I'm sure he's very excited about that. He knew how to have a good time, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, and Eric knew how to have a good time, right? Yeah. All right, so it's all good. All right, so if you're going to join me in the Gemara, and of course I always suggest you do, I'm a very booky guy, as you know. Daf Zayin Amud Beis, page 7, side B, and I know many of you have the Art Scroll version. It's probably 7B2. That's my guess. I didn't look, but that's my guess. So the Gemara talks about the mitzvah of Mishloach Manot, sending the parcels of food to a friend on Purim, and then the Gemara talks about the mitzvah of Matanot Le'Evyonim. The Gemara is talking about things we have to do on Purim. And the Gemara turns its attention to Su'udat Purim. And if you want to know more about the Su'udah in general, I refer you to a class that I recently gave, which is called Holy Wine. That's part of the series on Megillat Esther. Tonight's class will not be about the Su'udah per se, but about one particular element of Su'udat Purim, namely the drinking part. Is it true that a Jew has to get drunk on Purim?
Yeah.
Yeah? You're so sure, eh?
It's saying somewhere.
It says somewhere. Well,
Ad lo yada.
it says somewhere Ad lo yada. Yeah, it's even a famous song. So what we're going to do now is we are going to take a look at the origin of the whole drinking story. It's a ruling, a halacha, that comes from the great sage Rabba. Omar Rabba. Rabba said, Michayev inish libisumei bepuria. A person is obligated to get besumid on Purim. What does it mean to get besumid? In English we would say you're obligated to get loaded. How do I know that? Well, Rashi, who is our most important ingredient in any understanding of the Gemara, Rashi says la'abesumi. Rashi's version of the Gemara had an aleph in the front. Many of the Rishonim, they say la'abesumi, although the Gemara as we have it is libisumi. Rashi says la'abesumi lehishtaker beyayin. It is an obligation to get drunk on wine. That's what Rabba says. How drunk? You know, because there's like levels of drunk. Does it mean tipsy? Does it mean hammered? Does it mean wasted? How drunk? So Rabba says, Rabba's talking halacha. Halacha has to be clear. He says, Ad lo yoda bein oror Haman lebaruch Mordechai. Until you cannot discern between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. It's very interesting, as you'll see, when this halacha is quoted, it's quoted the other way around. Baruch Haman and Baruch Mordechai and Oror Haman. But in the Gemara it says, until he doesn't know the difference between Oror Haman and Baruch Mordechai. That's very, very drunk. I don't even know how you get so drunk. Let's make it simple. I mean, for me as a chassid, I would say Mordechai is the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and Haman is Hitler Yimach Shemo. I can't even imagine. I don't know how drunk does that look. Very, very, very drunk. That you don't know the difference. But that's what Rava says. Now the Gemara does something very interesting. The Gemara tells us a story. And oftentimes when the Gemara wants to illustrate halacha lemase, what we're actually supposed to do, the Gemara will tell us a story. So the Gemara tells a story. And this is a story that happens a generation later. Rabba v'Reb Zera, both disciples of Rava. So these two outstanding Torah leaders, great sages, Avdu Seudas Purim Bahade Hadadi. They had Seudat Purim together. That sounds nice. Two very illustrious rabbis having dinner together on a joyous day. I wonder how that went. Well, they were disciples of Rava, and Rava said it's a halacha that a person is obligated to get wasted. So what do you think they did? They did precisely that. Ibsum. They got loaded. And then the Gemara says, and I will translate this in its literal fashion, Kom Rabba, Rabba got up, Shachtel Reb Zera. He slaughtered Reb Zera. Lamachar, the next day, as he woke up in the morning, he said, oh my gosh, what do I do over here? This does not look good. Rashi says, Ibsum nishtakru. They got drunk. Boy Rachme. So he prays or pleads for mercy for Reb Zera, va'achye, and he brings him back to life. So he killed him and brought him back to life. Lishana, a year later, Omar Lei, Rabba says to Reb Zera, Nesi mar v'na'aved sudas purim b'hadei adodi. I'd love for you to join me for dinner again. Omar Lei, Reb Zera says, yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that every year a miracle will happen, and in case you decide to take me out again, I'm not sure you'll be able to bring me back again. So you know what? Enjoy dinner by yourself. It reminds me of the story of this husband and wife. They got into a terrible fight, and the husband stormed out, and 2 hours later he calls up and he says, hi, what's for dinner? She says, dinner? Dinner? Poison is for dinner. He says, good, make one portion, I'm not coming. Like, what in heaven does this mean? What does this mean? Again, the Gemara says a halacha. You get drunk, you have to get drunk. And Rabba and Reb Zera got so drunk that Rabba killed Reb Zera. Well, that's what it says. It says he slaughtered him. And then the next day he brought him back to life. And then he invited him next year. How about another go around at the drinking table? And Reb Zera said, you know what, I'm going to pass. I'm not coming this time. That's the Gemara. Incidentally, the Tosfos does not shed any light. Tosfos doesn't really say anything here. Tosfos says, Layada ben Oror Haman lebaruch Mordechai. Tosfos says, and the rest of the sentence too. So you got so drunk, you don't know the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Oror Haman, and the same thing, Arura Zeresh, Brucha Esther, you don't know the difference between Zeresh and Esther. That's, by the way, Mrs. Haman, Mrs. Last Lady. Arurim kol Rashayim, cursed be all the wicked. Baruchim kol Yehudim, may all the Jewish people be blessed. You don't know the difference. So what exactly Tosfos adds to the mix and how he helps us understand, we'll discuss in a few moments. But that is the words of the Gemara as we see them. Now, of course, it's very hard to know what to do from the Gemara because oftentimes the Gemara will bring a variety of different opinions, and sometimes the Gemara will quote things or say things which are not necessarily supposed to be acted upon. Although this seems actable because we have a Ma'aser Rav. This is what the sages did. Rabbeinu Alfasi, the Rif, took it upon himself to rewrite the Talmud Bavli in halachic prose. In the first attempt at codification of ritual law, of halacha, the Rif creates a body of Gemaras. According to some opinions, he had them in one very thick volume in the beginning, where all the Gemara had the arguments and the discussions kind of surgically removed, and he only rewrote halacha, only the things that were binding. So if somebody wanted to, say, open Masechet Megillah and find out what to do, he could read the writings of the Rif, we're going back about 900 plus years, and he could simply know what the halacha is. Well, it's important to know that when the Rif, when the Alphas rewrites the Gemara in halachic prose, and I quote, Amar Rava, Michayev, Inish, Libsumi, Bepuria, Adalayoda, Min Baruch Haman, LaBaruch Mordechai, LaOrer Haman. So the Rif transposes Mordechai and Haman, placing Mordechai first and Haman second. But other than that change, he quotes the Gemara verbatim in halachic prose. Halacha. You're obligated to get so drunk you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. It doesn't bring any stories. The Rif is not a storybook. It doesn't tell you even stories which are important because they indicate how we should follow the halacha. It simply states that halacha. The Rambam, Maimonides, in his codes, the Rambam had a fantastic system in which he created a whole new system for Torah Sheba'al Peh, incorporating everything from the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, from the Midrashim, what's called Mechilta, Safra, Sifri, and even writings of the Gaonim. And the Rambam built his own 14-tiered system. 14 books, Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah, a restatement of the entire Torah in halacha. And he created what we call halachot, sets of halacha, not necessarily according to the system that was employed by the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Rambam, in the book of Zmanim, which is the third of 14 books, in the last set of halachas, which is called Megillah and Chanukah, actually there's, I think halachas Tainus comes after that. Maybe not. No, that is the last halachas of the book. It's called Laws of Megillah and Chanukah, and the first two chapters talk about Purim. So, Pedig Beis, Halacha Tezvav, Halacha 15, the Rambam, after telling us that one is obligated to eat Su'udat Purim during the day and not at night, which incidentally in our Gemara follows the Halacha. That's the next piece of Gemara. The next Gemara is going to talk about that. The Rambam doesn't mention Rava, doesn't, as you'll see in a moment, doesn't mention specifically this idea of an obligation to drink until a certain point, but he says the following. First he says, you're obligated to have a meal. When are you obligated to have a meal? Somewhere during the day of Purim. And then he has to define the meal. What should the meal look like? French toast, does that work? Cheerios? What do you have to serve? He said, Ketzad chovat seuda zu. What does this meal look like? Or what is the obligation? And he says, sheyochal basar. The Rambam is of the opinion that one must eat meat on Purim, and there's a big discussion about this in the Holy Wine. I touched on it. I'm not going to go into it now. And he says, so it's not going to be French toast. It's going to be a meat meal, not a dairy meal, unless you're a vegetarian. V'yitakein su'uda na'ah. Make it a beautiful meal. How beautiful? Well, depends what you can afford. Kafi asher timtze yado. If you're very wealthy and your only child was getting married, you'd probably make a beautiful meal. Well, that's the kind of meal you should make on Purim. What if you're very poor and you got 18 kids to marry off? It might not make such a fancy meal for everybody. Okay, then that's the meal you make for Purim. You make the kind of meal you can afford. It should be lavish by your standards. And of course, that can vary in every time and in every place. So the halacha doesn't impose a certain amount of food that has to be eaten or even a certain kind of food that has to be prepared in a particular way. although there are things like that in halacha. You have to eat matzah. You have to eat matzah, a certain amount of matzah, and a certain time of matzah. That's not the halacha here. This is not exactly what you have to eat. It's a meat meal, he says, and it should be a beautiful meal. Whatever you call beautiful. That's the theory of relativity. It's a relative term. Okay. Anything else? The Rambam says, yeah. In addition to all that fine food, he says, Vishote yayin. You drink wine. How much? Ad sheyishtaker. Until you get drunk. And how does the Rambam define drunk? He says, V'yirodem b'shichrus. You get wasted. You go down. In Yiddish, they call it trinken bis mis unteren Tisch. I'm not sure the equivalent in English. Maybe getting wasted. You drink till you're under the table. You drink them under the table. That's what the Rambam says. You drink wine till you're under the table. Sounds like halacha. The Gemara says it. The Rif says it. The Rambam says it. Now, when it comes to halacha, all of Jewish law is built on three platforms. The three platforms which are placed side by side are Rif, Rambam, Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher is the last of them, and he rewrote the Gemara, but not in Gemara prose and halacha prose. He didn't use a new system like the Rambam. He used the system of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the system of the Mishnah, but he rewrote halacha. So what does the Rosh say? Well, we'll take a look. The Rosh says, most of the first chapter of Masechet Megillah, by the way, is filled with, at least the second half of the chapter, is filled with beautiful teachings about the Megillah. None of that makes it into the halacha, because it's not halachic. It's agadic. So in section 8 of the first chapter, he opens with the words, Omar Rava, Rava said, Michayev inish lebsumi bepuria, a person is obligated to get drunk on Purim. We know what besumi means already. How much? Ad lo yoda, until you don't know. What don't you know? You don't know ben Baruch Mordechai la Orur Haman. He does the same thing the Rif does. The Gemara says Orur Haman, Baruch Mordechai. The Rosh inverts it, speaking first about Baruch Mordechai, and he says that's how drunk. And then, very interestingly, because the Tosfos makes a comment on the Gemara, something about Brucha Esther, Arura Zeresh. So the Rosh says, and the Talmud Yerushalmi says, that you have to say after the reading of the Megillah, Arur Haman, Baruch Mordechai, Arura Zeresh, Brucha Esther, Arurim Kol Rishoyim, Bruchim Kol Yisrael, Gam Charvoina Zachor Latov. In our version, it's Bruchim Kol Tzadikim, or Kol Chasidim. At any rate, that's what he says. He says this is after the Megillah, which is very hard to understand what he's saying, because if the point was that you have to say this, but you won't be able to say it, you're saying it after the Megillah, and generally the meal didn't start yet. It doesn't say you're obligated to get drunk, then read the Megillah. That would be a very funny story. Instead, it says listen to the Megillah properly, say whatever you're supposed to say, and then get drunk. So what is the Rosh trying to say here? Maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. Now, this is like unbelievable, because we have a statement in the Gemara. The Gemara gives us a story that seems to indicate this was a statement that was acted upon by the greatest of sages. And then we have the Shloisha Amudei Ha'ira, the three pillars of halacha, all speak in, if not the same, a very, very common voice. A very common voice. Rambam doesn't mention Haman and Mordechai. Rif mentions only Haman and Mordechai. The Rosh mentions more to Esther and Zeresh. So what's the halacha? Okay, so we'll take a look in the Tur. In the Tur, which is written by the son of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Yaakov Bal HaTurim. Rabbeinu Yaakov Bal HaTurim, now we're going we're about 500 years ago, 5 centuries ago. And Rabbeinu Yaakov Bal HaTurim, he creates a new system different from the Rambam system, because the Rambam system covers the entirety of Torah, including laws of ritual purity and impurity that do not apply today, including laws of offerings in the Beis HaMikdash that do not apply today, including laws of building and maintaining the Beis HaMikdash that don't apply today, and many other things, like the Jubilee, things that don't apply. So the Yaakov said, look, I'm here to tell people practical halacha. Now, practical halacha means we have to extrapolate the things they need to know on a regular basis. The daily halachas, he put into one section. He called it Orach Chaim, the way of life. Here's how a Jew gets up in the morning. Here's what a Jew does during the course of his day. Here's how he goes to sleep. That includes everything from morning blessings to the daily davening to grace after meals to saying the Shema before you go to sleep. Everything is included in Orach Chaim and the holidays. How do you celebrate Shabbat? How do you celebrate the festivals? And Orach Chaim ends with the laws of Megillah and Hanukkah. Then we have another section which is called Yoredeya. This will show us wisdom or the way a Jew is supposed to understand the knowledge of the world. Something called Chosh and Mishpat, which deals with the justice system. And finally, we have something called Even Ezer, which deals with matrimonial issues. I'm not going to discuss why those names are given, but those are the 4 sections. So in his system, he created 4 sections, and then the 4 sections have chapter numbers. And by the way, the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo uses that exact system, as do all subsequent halachas. All subsequent halachic works follow that system. The Tur in Orach Chaim. Orach Chaim is the way a Jew lives life. This is the end of Orach Chaim. Chapter Tov Reish Tzadik Hey. Tov is 400. Reish is 200. Tzadik Hey is 95. Chapter 695. He says, mitzvah laharbot b'sudat Purim. It's a mitzvah to make it lavish. It should be one of, if not the most special meal of the year.
But he mentions the time, or the daytime, or evening.
Everybody says day. There's not even a question. That's a clear halacha. But that's not the point of today's class. It's a clear halacha. And then he says, vitzarich. You know what vitzarich in Hebrew means? Vitzarich, and you have to sheyishtaker, you have to get drunk. Straight halacha. How much? Ad shelo yoda bein orur Haman lebaruch Mordechai. Very interesting. He uses the system of the Gemara. He says until you don't know between orur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. The Rif and the Rosh invert it. He goes back to the way of the Gemara. He says ben orur Haman lebaruch Mordechai. And then, since you asked, the next halacha is if him achal balayla, if you eat the night of Purim, lo yatzai, he didn't fulfill the mitzvah. So it has to be eaten during the day. Straight halacha. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? Got a question here.
So why we make this Purim party at night?
Zalman is asking, he doesn't understand. How can we say drink until you get wasted? How are you going to daven Ma'ariv? It's a very good question. It's actually dealt with in Shulchan Aruch, but a little patience will be a very virtuous thing right now. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? The Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo, same system, Orach Chaim, chapter 695. He begins with a statement, not follows it. He starts off by saying, Sudat Purim, you make it at night, you're wasting your time. That's why you don't bother making a big thing the night of Purim. You don't get a mitzvah for it. Mitzvahs during the day. He says you should be happy at night. The Ramah says be happy. You have a little l'chaim, that's fine. And then the second halacha, the second paragraph in chapter 695, quote, Chayiv inish lebesumi bepurio adalayoda ben orur Haman lebaruch Mordechai. He uses the language of the Tur, and he says straight up, it's actually verbatim the Gemara. A person is obligated to get intoxicated on Purim until he doesn't know the difference between cursed is Haman and Baruch, blessed is Mordechai. What in the heaven is going on over here? Sounds like we all need to get drunk. You want to pass me a cup, please? Oh, it's not Purim, sorry. Now, you know many, many observant, fine people. This is not your first rodeo, not your first Purim, who didn't get drunk on Purim. Are they all in violation of the Shulchan Aruch? I mean, how does this work? So let's go back now to the time of the Rishonim. By the way, the Ramah, Rabbeinu Moshe Isserles, he makes a little notation. We're going to go back to the Ramah soon. The Ramah says, well, the Shulchan Aruch does say that, but before we go to the Ramah, we have to understand the background of how one can one can say differently. It seems so far abundantly clear. There's a halacha in the Gemara, there's a story of it being acted upon, and then all of the platforms of halacha rule commonly, and the Shulchan Aruch says it. So let's go back to the Rif. That was our original, our first stop in the halacha arena. The Rif is printed just like the Gemara. It looks like a page of Gemara. In the inside, we have Rashi's commentary. So we are able to learn the Rif, because people would learn the Rif, they didn't know what's going on. The Rif he uses the language of the Gemara. So you have Rashi explaining it. And then, on the outside of the page, like the Tosfos commentary on the Gemara, there is commentary of a later Rishon, the next generation Rishon, one of the early medieval sages, commenting on the words of the Rif. And there are, the entirety of the Talmud is not covered by one, but much of the Talmud. Solomon, I told you patience. You're asking about Birchas HaMazon. We're going to get there, relax. Okay. On Masechet Megillah, the commentary on the outside of the page is written by the great Rishon Rabbeinu Nissim. Rabbeinu Nissim comments in the following. He transcribes the words of the Rif, and he says, yeah, because it says in the Gemara. We read the Gemara together. And he adds, like the Tosfos does, he adds the words, Barucha Esther, Arura Zeresh, blessed is Esther, cursed is Zeresh. And he adds, Gam Charvoina Zachar Latov, a little bit of a different, slightly different verbiage. It doesn't talk about the Rishoyim and the Tzadikim or the Chasidim or the Yehudim or the Yisraelim. And then he says, Umechayev, and the obligation, it seems, would be, Libisumi, to get hammered, Adela Yoda, my kamar, till you don't know what you're saying. So first of all, he just said something here. The Ran just added a few important words. He said, presumably what Tosfos does by making a longer sentences, he says, because if you have to say 3 words when you're intoxicated, you can get away with 3 words or 4 words. If you have to start saying a whole sentence, at some point you don't know what you're saying. So he says here, it's not just Or Haman and Baruch Mordechai, and Baruch Esther and Arura Zeresh and Gam Charvoina, and at some point you don't know what you're saying. In other words, the Ran is commenting and he's explaining. He says, what does it mean that you don't know the difference between Baruch Mordechai, and Or Haman? It means not that you don't know the difference. He says, that's crazy. You can't even imagine being that drunk. It means you can't get the words out. You know, people are drunk when they're wasted. You can't speak a sentence. So why does it say it only like that? We'll soon see. Many of the Rishonim will tell us that the Gemara just uses a shortened version. Rabba didn't use a lot of words, but he meant the whole sentence. And that's what the Ran says, that's the meaning of the Gemara. However, the Ran says, I don't necessarily agree that this is the halacha. Because he says, V'kosev Rabbeinu Ephraim Zechernu Leveracha. Rabbeinu Ephraim was one of the most outstanding Balei HaTosfos. Rabbeinu Ephraim wrote, Mehahi Uvda, from the story that the Gemara brings, that Rabba rose and he slaughtered Reb Zeder, Idchele Memre. The Gemara is not trying to bolster the story. The Gemara is trying to prove to you that this ruling is not a ruling. It's like, here was a ruling, and this is what happened. You think that's normal? People went for dinner, and somebody killed his friend? That's not normal. So don't do this halacha. Don't do it. That's what Rabbeinu Ephraim said. Rabbeinu Ephraim says the fact that the Gemara quotes the story invalidates the halacha rather than validates it. V'lo shaper domi lemevet hachi. Not a good idea to behave this way. Not a good idea. That's what he says. In the commentary of the Bal HaMoir, the Moir HaKotan says, also commenting on the Rif, he says, yeah, very nice what he quotes, However, I want you to know that Rabbeinu Ephraim says that from the fact that the Gemara tells such a story, idchalu lememre, that this halacha was pushed aside. V'les hilchasa kavasei. He adds a few important words here. He doesn't just say, you don't have to do this. He says it's not the halacha. It's not the halacha. Leishaper domi lemevad hachi. Bad idea. Don't get wasted. Don't get hammered. Now, it's very nice that Rabbeinu Ephraim says this, but the Rif doesn't say it. The Rif says it's halacha. I mean, if the Rif would agree, he wouldn't put this in here. The Rif certainly doesn't seem to agree. And the Rosh doesn't agree. And the Rambam doesn't seem to agree. And for that matter, the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch don't seem to agree. But that's what he says. A different school of thought. On the Rosh, there's a commentary which is known as the Korban Nesanel. The Korban Nesanel says, Rashi says, Besumi means lihishtaker b'yayin, to get drunk. He says, I can't argue with Rashi. But if it wasn't Rashi, I would have said maybe, if it means getting drunk, I would use the word lemerave. Besumi is a funny word. It doesn't mean getting drunk. Maybe tipsy. It doesn't mean getting drunk, he says. This is kind of like, doesn't seem to buy into that. Now, before I come back to the Rosh, I just want to suggest to you, just suggesting, it seems from Rabbeinu Ephraim and from the Baal HaMoyer that there is no halacha to drink to the point of intoxication. In fact, it seems there's no halacha to drink altogether. Because the halacha was to drink till you're hammered, wasted, and he says it's not the halacha. It seems there's no halacha at all to drink. He's not the only one who says this. Very strangely, the very same Shulchan Aruch that says Chayev inish l'mesumi b'puria, in his commentary on the Tur, on that very same chapter, the Beis Yosef says, he says, this is written in the Gemara. It's a memory of Rabba, and the Tosfos says that it means that you don't know the difference not just between Orur, Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, but Brucha Esther, Arurim and Arura Zeresh, Bruchim, Arurim call it Shoyim, Bruchim call it Tzadikim. So he seems to be following the Ran's approach, that it doesn't mean you don't know the difference. You can't speak a straight sentence because you're too hammered or wasted to speak a straight sentence. And he said the Ran says that too. Because the Beis Yosef says what some of you might be thinking. The I bein Or Haman leBaruch Mordechai, if you're talking about not knowing the difference between Haman and Mordechai, he says, Afilu shasa tuva loy toibe. Even if you got so hammered, you couldn't make such a mistake. No normal Jew can make such a mistake. It's not possible. Whoever is the biggest Gadol b'Yisrael, the greatest leader of the Jewish people, the greatest tzaddik, whoever that is to you out there, whoever that is, put him and Hitler on the other side. You could mix them up. It's impossible. It's crazy. It can't be like that. So therefore, the Beis Yosef says it doesn't mean that. It means you can't get a sentence out. Since you're supposed to say this sentence, you can't get a sentence out. That's what it has to mean. That's what he says. And then the Beis Yosef says that the Ran brings down Rabbeinu Ephraim. We just learned it together before. And he says that from the story that the Gemara repeats afterwards, it's clear that this is not the halacha. Idche, memory de Rava. The teaching of Rava was cast aside, overridden. And he says you shouldn't do this. In fact, the Beis Yosef says, that's written in the Erches Chaim, lo yishtaker, you shouldn't get drunk. Shahashikros isur gomer, because getting drunk is totally prohibited. Ve'elocha avera gedola mizu, and there's no greater sin than getting drunk. It's a goyrem, it causes licentiousness and murder and all kinds of terrible sins. That's what the Beis Yosef says. But funny enough, in Shulchan Aruch, he just said, Chayev inish l'mesuri b'puria, ad le'yoda. So Rabbi Beis Yosef, could you please, would the real Beis Yosef please rise? You do get drunk, you don't get drunk. Sounds very strange. Interestingly enough, the Taz Magen David, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says on the words of the Shulchan Aruch. He says, it's based on the words of Rabba. However, there's a story brought, and the story demonstrates that things got really out of hand. Kivan the Gemara maybe al the Rabba shachtel rebzeda shma mino maskonos haGemara ein lasis kain. Don't do it. He's funny. He's commenting on the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef says the same thing in his commentary in the Torah, but then in Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef says chayv v'nish l'b'surim b'puria. Is this just saying words? Is that a game? The Beis Yosef understood the seriousness of the mission he had taken upon himself. He's telling you the halacha. He's the Meir Hiroi. He gives direction for the Jewish people. So what is going on over here? Rabbeinu Menachem Meiri, who is another one of the great Rishonim, many of his works were not available until recently. The Meiri on the Gemara says that which is written in the Gemara, the Layada ben Or Haman lebarach Mordechai, he says, already kvar pirshu ktsat geonim. And the fact that he mentions geonim, the geonic period is the period before the Rishonim. We quoted Rabbeinu Ephraim so far. But he says already in the time of the geonim they said, that which is written afterwards, that Rabba shechted Reb Zera, nidchu kol otam advarim. They shut the door on this. It was entirely cast aside. Don't get drunk. What's wrong with you? Don't do this. And then he says, if you want to know how to understand the difference between Baruch, not to know between Baruch Mordechai and Or Haman, how do you? So he says, what it means is that there's a verse that you say after the Megillah, Or Haman, Baruch Mordechai, Brucha Esther, Ruah Zeresh, the Gam Chavreina, Zachal Atayv. So he says what the Gemara was saying is, Chayev lehizbasim, you have to get so drunk, so intoxicated, actually you can't say this whole sentence. You start to mumble and fumble, you can't get through it. But, he says, that halacha was anyway overridden. You don't have to get drunk at all. There is no halacha to get drunk. He says, Rabba didn't shecht Reb Zera. The word shachte is like schita, he squeezed him. He made him very uncomfortable, he made him sick. He beat him up, and then he miraculously healed him. But he says this is all, that was the Gemara's supposition. That was the Gemara's original thought. But in fact, that is not the halacha. So, we have all the halachic foundations of the Jewish people are telling us we have to get drunk. And then we have some of the Rishonim who are not the halacha that are telling us, well, you don't have to get drunk at all. So the thing is, there is a middle approach here. And maybe even though I presented this approach as don't get drunk at all, maybe it doesn't mean don't get drunk at all. Maybe what it really means is you have to say l'chaim. You have to be tipsy and elevated, but you don't have to be crazy out of your head. So let's go back to the Korban Nesanel. The Korban Nesanel says, what is the meaning then? He says, the Gemara says this, and it says get drunk. I would argue with Rashi, but I can't argue with Rashi. So that has to be the meaning of Psumei. He says, Hakavana shemichayiv lehetiv lev ayedei shtiyat yain harbe. You have to become merry-hearted. Merry with wine. If we were drinking, by now we'd be a little merry and a little silly, and it wouldn't be so serious. It says to be merry. Freilich. Mevusam. Freilich. What do we call in Yiddish? Freilich. It doesn't say get drunk. He didn't say chayav adam lehishtaker, chayav l'rave. He said chayav adam lebesumi. People are obligated to be uplifted, joyous. Not wasted, not hammered. Tipsy. A little. That's all you need. And he says ad alayada. The Korban Nesanel says a very interesting thing. Ad v'loy ad b'chlal. In Hebrew, there's an expression in Talmudic literature, if ad means including the benchmark or up to the benchmark. So the Korban Nesanel says, ad v'lo ad b'chlal. Up to the benchmark, not further. You don't have to actually be that drunk. Up to that point. Up to the point where you can't get the sentence out straight. That's what it means. And he says, definitely, it does not mean that a person should drink so much wine that he gets so wasted, like the story of Lot, who got so wasted, he ended up sleeping with his daughters. And that's one of the most awful incidents in the entirety of the Bible. A sordid, tragic, really, really whacked out kind of situation.
Noach was too.
Yeah, Noach. And how did that well? How well did that go for Noach? Not very well. We'll soon talk about that. That's where the Rishonim asked the question. Drunk? Seriously? So the Korban Nesanel's approach is, and on the Rosh, he says, yes, the Rosh does say Mechayev Inish Libsumi, and that's the Halacha. But he doesn't say until, meaning including that you're so hammered. It doesn't say wasted, he said. That's not what it means. Ad Aliyada means, he says, up until that point. The Gemara is saying is, don't get wasted. The Halacha saying is, don't get wasted. Ad, until wasted. Meaning, be happy, not trashed. That's what the Korban Nesanel says. Incidentally, there's a Sfas Emes, which is a commentary on the Gemara, a late commentary from the 19th century, and I shared it in the class I gave called Holy Wine, that the Sfas Emes says that Ad Aliyada means you have a continuous obligation until you reach that point. And then after that point, you're no longer obligated to drink wine anymore. Up until that point.
You shouldn't be able to speak
If you up until you start slurring your speech.
because we've discounted not being able to tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, not be. The Beis Yosef says you have to be like drunk as Lot, and that's not a good thing. That's he can't even imagine that.
If part of the, if I understand correctly, part of the theme or the momentum of Purim is to reveal the concealed, and if you're so gone, you're going to miss it.
What you're saying is very profound and correct. That part of Purim is to get to a certain point of revealing the concealed, and here you're going to be checked out, which is not the point. But let's go through. Okay, I just want to mention, by the way, if you think this is scary, there's much more books. I spent a long time deciding which books not to include. Okay, I'm not. There's a lot of. I could really confuse you if you wanted, but that's probably not such a good idea, right? So I'm just I tried to pick out just some basics. This is not an absolute, so to speak, exhaustive review of the subject, but it's a well-rounded. You're gonna come out with a good knowledge. So again, in the first approach, we said it sounds like get hammered, so hammered that Rabba shechted b'zera, and then that seems to be the halacha. Then we introduce a school of thought that says no. First of all, it doesn't even mean that. Second of all, it doesn't matter. That halacha is not a halacha. That's very problematic. Approach seems to say you don't have to drink wine at all. That's not what it seems like in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Korban Nesanel explains the Rosh, and he says, yes, it means up until that point, not beyond that point. And he says, it's something that means you have to drink wine, and Rabba didn't mean to get that hammered. But why does the Gemara bring a story? Okay, we'll soon see in a minute. I'm going to give you now another proof that the idea of drinking wine is not cast aside, even if the idea of drunkenness is. Avu Darham, one of the earliest manuscripts of halacha on daily life and the holidays, Shabbat and the holidays. In the Sefer Avu Darham, he says like this. The Gemara says that you have to get so drunk, la besumi, adaliyoda ben or haman lebarach Mordechai. All right, that's the language of the Gemara. He says there are those who explain this. Achi eschalef haman b'Mordechai. You actually confuse the two. Very hard to understand. And then he says there's another approach. V'yesh mefarshim oror haman oila leminyan barach Mordechai. You know what gematria is? Hebrew numerology, Aleph is 1, Beis is 2, Gimel is 3. That's up to Yud, which is 10, then Chaf is 20, Lamed is 30. That takes you up to Kuf, which is 100. And then comes Reish, which is 200, Shin, which is 300. So there's numerology. You can add up the numbers. If you add up the numerology of Orur Haman, cursed is Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, it's the same number. It comes to 502. So it basically means you're so drunk you can't do mathematics. What he means to say is, this is not a good time to do your books if you're planning to file your taxes early. Purim night is probably not a good time to sit down and do your taxes. The numbers might look a little strange. And then Avu Darham says, how could you get drunk? He says, drunk? We have so many places in the Torah where it's a terrible thing. We have Lot, Noach and Lot. So he says it doesn't mean to get drunk. It means shtiyat yayin. And when the shtiyat yayin, we remember the miracle. And he says that's because the whole miracle happened with wine. Vashti went down because of wine. Esther was welcomed with wine. Haman, the whole thing happened over multiple glasses of wine. So in order for us to remember the miracle, it plays a role. So the Avu Darham is very clear. Yes, of course you have to drink. It would be a mistake to take Rabbeinu Ephraim or Beis Yosef or Taz at face value that the whole drinking thing is dismissed. What they would mean to say is drinking in such excess is dismissed. But again, the Shulchan Aruch does seem to say it. Now, the Levush, the Baal HaLevush, Mordechai Yaffe, was something very interesting. He comes after the Torah, he uses the Torah system. He wanted to write the Shulchan Aruch, but the Beis Yosef had the schus. His work was, he became the Shulchan Aruch. And the Levush is an important document of Halacha, and it's often used for cross-reference. It's codes. And he says in chapter 695, he says like this. Levush sometimes with a few words adds a very, very profound nuance. It says like this. Tzorech lehishtaker ad shelo yoidea ben orur Haman lebarach Mordechai. Arur zeresh, brucha Esther, arurim kol shoyim. And he says, wish bepashtus is the way, like the Ran says, the Tosfos. You have a lot of words, you can't get the words out. You're not able to speak coherently. You speak short sentences, you can't. And what's up with this, he says? He says, when you reach the point of tipsiness, where you can't speak straight, you must be happy by now. It's like, are you happy yet? Oh, I'm happy now. Oh, great. Okay, that's Purim. So he says, that's what this is about. Yes, you have to drink wine. No, you don't have to get wasted. Now let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yosef Karo seems to say, Chai v'nish l'psumi. He doesn't explain it. He just says it straight like it is. The Ramah definitely believed that that's what the Beit Yosef meant, because he is arguing with the Beis Yosef. He is saying, and there is an opinion, v'yesh shomrim, and others say, ein tzarich lehishtaker kol kach. You don't have to get that drunk. So clearly the Beis Yosef is ruling you do have to get drunk. Because if the Ramah is arguing, the Ramah is saying, Beis Yosef, you said you have to get that drunk. I'm telling you, you don't have to get that drunk. Ein tzarich lehishtaker kol kach. Ella sheyishte yoter milimudo. Well, how much wine do you have to drink? He says more than you usually drink. It shouldn't be like a regular day in business. Not a regular Shabbat. And then the Ramah leans on the Rambam. And he says, and what about the business of not knowing which way is up or down? He says, you should go to sleep a little. Whenever you drink a lot of wine, it's not very hard to fall asleep. Put your head down on the table, fall asleep a little, and during the time you were sleeping, you didn't know which way was up. Life is great. You were happy, you were tipsy, you slept a little, you fulfilled everything. And that way you don't know ben orur Haman lebarach Mordechai. And then the Ramah adds a number of very important words. Ve'echad hamarbe, whether one drinks a lot of wine. Ve'echad hamaymet, whether somebody is minimal in his intake. Uvilvad sheyichav libe l'shamayim. The important thing here is not to be a wild animal, crazed drunk. The important thing is that your goal is to serve Hashem. Your goal is to serve Hashem. And if you think you're going to serve Hashem better with a lot of wine, okay, as long as your goal is to serve God. Purim is not crazy time where we do whatever we want. As some people mistakenly think. Purim is the time to be a nut job, do whatever you want, everything goes, it's Purim. Chas v'shalom. Purim is not a time of freedom from Torah mitzvahs. Purim is a time to experience the holiness of Torah mitzvahs in a transcendent way. It's a time to be able to connect to a higher and deeper level. It's not a time, chas v'shalom, of throwing off the yoke of Shemayim. And therefore, the Ramah says, whatever you're going to do, remember, The reason you're doing what you're doing on Purim is because you want to be a servant of Hashem. That's what this is about. To conclude this little part of it, I want to share with you the words of the Bach, which is a later commentary on the Torah, the Bayit Chodesh. The Bach says like this. The Bach says, yeah, it's in the Gemara we read together, and it says, Ben Ar Haman, he adds the words, Arura Zeresh, following the Tosfos' interpretation of the Gemara, which is actually interpretive. It's interpreting. That doesn't mean you don't know the difference between Ar Haman and Baruch Mordechai. It means you can't get the sentence out straight. And he says, the Ran was suggesting that sometimes that the meaning of the halacha of Rava was that a person doesn't know the difference between Ar Haman and Baruch Mordechai, which, as the Beis Yosef pointed out, is like incongruous, impossible. So he says, well, the Aguda, which is another important halachic work, he puts it this way. And he's going to say the same thing we just heard before in the Avud Arham. He says, the Aguda says that the Cheshben Zekazeh, the Gematria, is 502. So it means that you can't do math. You can't do arithmetic. That's what it means, halachically. And then the Bach says, however, Lefi Aniyas Daiti, in my halachic opinion, my halachic opinion is kipshute. The Gemara says what it says, it means what it says. This is all Baba Maisis, he says. These are cute little stories. It doesn't say till you don't know how to do math. There's a way to say that. It doesn't say that. It's like scratching your left hand with your right ear. You meant to say till you can't do your taxes, so you said, Or Haman and Baruch Mordechai, and you're waiting for somebody to figure out that both are 502, and now that's what it means, can't do. He says, no, I'm very sorry. In halacha, it means yishtaker harbe adala yada. You don't know, ma'achiluk, you don't know which way is up and down. You're totally in a state of befuddlement. And it's, yeah, he says, it's pretty close to Lot, but not like Lot, but pretty close. And then he says, what? But that sounds crazy. Is that what the halacha warrants? He says, he shouldn't say, how could you do such a thing? How could such a thing be possible? He says, Rabba and Reb Zera definitely got that drunk. If Rabba killed Reb Zera, it must have been something really, that's a party, man. He was really wasted. And he says, Rabbeinu Ephraim suggests that the reason of the story is to tell you that the halacha is not a halacha. However, he says that does not seem to be the case. Does not seem to be the case. And he says, therefore, bottom line, whatever the Gemara meant, it meant it literally. So what should we do? He says, practically, a person has to drink harbe milimude. He has to drink a lot more than he's used to. Not a little more, a lot more. Sheyetiv libe b'mishta. Similar to the words of the Levush. So he should be very, very merry in heart. He should be intoxicated, tipsy. Afilu shikr. What kind of shikr? The kind of shikr that if you had to appear to speak before a king, you would say, I can't do this. I cannot appear before the king right now. I can't get my words out straight. I guess you say for a rabbi, you can't give a sermon. Can't speak straight. Can't arrange your thoughts. So the Bach says Adal Yoda is Adal Yoda, and maybe the Gemara, is telling you the story to tell you, yeah, that's what they did, and they understood Rava very well. They knew exactly what Rava meant, but that's not what you have to do. Now the Darkei Moshe, who is the Ramah, in his commentary on the Torah, he says that it means cheshbon. You can't do the math. Okay, that's very nice. Can't do the math. The Ramah is consistent. The Ramah says it in his commentary here. The Ramah says it in Shulchan Aruch. But in Shulchan Aruch it says you're chayiv to drink. What is the pshat over here? What does this mean? Incidentally, when the Taz comments in the Shulchan Aruch that he says, quoting Ran and Rabbeinu Ephraim, that they shouldn't get drunk. So the Pri Megadim in his commentary on the Ran says, he says, well, if you look at the Pri Chadash, you'll see that you do have to drink. And if you're worried about fulfilling this mitzvah of Araham Baruch Mordechai, go to sleep. And he says, V'chein roi lasses. So the Taz seems to dispute what the Ramah says, and the Pri Megadim says, no. The Ramah says what he says, the Shulchan Aruch says what he says, and this is how to do it. This is how to do it. So here's something really, really fascinating. Here's something really fascinating, which follows along the lines of the Korban Asano. And this is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch that was written by Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolis, just to give you a little bit of who was Ephraim Zalman Margolis. Because what he writes here is really like out of this world. He writes about a dream he had, like communicate like a prophecy. So Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolis was a man who was so revered by the Rabbeim that after the Alter Rebbe's Histalkos, that Tzemach Tzedek asked his shilas to Rabbi Ephraim Zalman. And there's a specific story that they tell that the Alter Rebbe, in the final moments of his life, he said to the Tzemach Tzedek, is there any question you have to ask? Is there any question you have to ask? And Tzemach Tzedek didn't understand, the one who understand what the Alter Rebbe was saying, and he didn't ask anything. And the Alter Rebbe was nostalgic a short while later. And then, after the separation of body and soul, or maybe, I don't know, right away, or after Shiva, the Tzemach Tzedek realized that the Alter Rebbe was talking about his son, who was missing, I think, 2 fingers, or 3 fingers. Naturally, he's missing fingers. And the question was, what should he do with regard to tefillin? Because the missing fingers were on his left hand. He was born with like 1 finger, 2 fingers. So he didn't know what to do. So the story goes that he got Reb Nechemia Dubrovna, who was a famous Hasidic Rav, to write the Shaila, and he gave him basically sources to write up the question with the different schools of thought, why he should put on tefillin in his left hand or why he shouldn't put it on his left hand. And then maybe the missing fingers on the right hand. That was a question. He was righty lefty. I don't know the exact details. But there was a question with missing fingers. Actually, I think it was missing fingers on his right hand. That was the Shaila. So Reb Nechemia had a talis factory. That's what he did for a living. He was a Rav, but he had a talis factory. And who did they send a letter to make a psak halacha? Reb Ephraim Zalman Margolis. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek relied on when he couldn't ask the Alter Rebbe. He relied on Reb Ephraim Zalman. And the story goes that Nechemia signed the letter Nechemia Fabrikant, which means Nechemia the factory man. And Rabbi Ephraim Zalman read over what the Nechemia had written in consultation with the Tzemach Tzedek, and he was blown away by the sheer brilliance of the different sides, the different approaches. And he said, Fabrikant, a factory? He says, all the factory owners in Dubrovna, they know how to learn like this? He was like, and anyway, he gave up whatever psak halacha, he gave up psak halacha. This just to give you who the Ephraim Zalman is. The Ephraim has a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch called the Yad Ephraim, and this is like astounding what he writes. He says, clearly he was bothered by this. He's bothered. And Hayom Yom, by the way, it's brought down that people who toil on Torah, tzaddikim who toil on Torah, they can have revelations at night. Gal Lehem Rozi Torah, it says. Secrets of Torah shared with them. He says, I'm just a small little guy. He says, Li Hatzoyer, Nisparish B'chizoyin Laila. I got clarity in a nocturnal vision. And he says like this. Iker Hachiyov Shal Hamishta, the main focus, the main obligation of the meal of Purim, Hu Sheyihiyeh Shori B'Simcha, that you should be joyous. That is the main thing. The main thing is you should be joyous. As it says in Tehillim, Yayin Yisamach Lavav Enosh, that wine gladdens a man's heart. Umach Mas Sheyeh Shori B'Simcha, when a person is in a state of joy, why is it so important to be joyous? He says, because then Yeh Chedvas Hashem Me'uzay. And when a person is in a state of joy, that's how he is able to experience that the joy of Hashem, that is the strength, that is the full brunt of Hashem's power is experienced through joy. And then he says, V'yitein todot v'halal Hashem. When a person is in a state of joy, he will acknowledge Hashem's kindness and he will thank God for the miracles of Purim. And that's what this is about. And he'll do it mitech harchavas halev, an open-hearted way. And he says, Ein loy lehishtaker yoyser midai. Don't get too drunk, because yizbalbal daitai. Then you're in a state of befuddlement. And he says, V'lo yaker b'teikef hanes. How will you know how great the miracle is if you don't know which way is up? The guy's trashed. Miracles? What miracles? Miracle, shmiracle. He's trashed. He's under the table. V'zehu sha'amru. This is the meaning of chayav adam l'msuim b'puria adalayada. And he says the same thing as the Karban Asano. Maybe he didn't see the Karban Asano. He says, adalayada v'loy ad b'chlal. V'loy ad b'chlal. Not further. What is the drinking supposed to look like? What is the halachic definition of this drinking? He says, libisumi ad gvul, until that border. Once you start getting crazy, stop. In other words, a yid says, it's Purim, I have to keep saying l'chaim. How did they say you have to know when to stop? When do you stop? You stop when you're getting crazy. When you start to whack out and lose it, start to get wasted, stop. Once you cross that line, you should know you went too far. That's not what the sages meant, exactly what you said. He doesn't not experience Purim. He's experienced stupor. He says, Shechayavu chachamim libsumi. Why was the chachamim say, it's a mitzvah to get hammered? Really? What's the mitzvah? I don't know. That's what it says. A mitzvah to get wasted. Everybody get wasted. Why should you get wasted? I don't know. Supposed to get wasted. No. You're supposed to realize the glory and the greatness of Hashem's miracles. And in order to do that, it helps to have a little wine, or maybe even a lot of wine, and a lot of l'chaim. The l'chaim elevates you, and a person sees things in a unique way. It loosens some of the things, the shackles that restrain our imagination, and disable us from expressing our joy in the most ebullient and effervescent way. So this loosens it. It loosens your inhibitions a little. But to get crazy, that was never the intention. He says, but what about the story? I mean, in the story, they get crazy. He kills him. So he says, Pshita, it's self-understood that when a person is so drunk, that ein by das v'tvuna l'shabech l'far al take off an s. If somebody is so drunk, he doesn't know the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Ar Haman, clearly he has no clue of what a miracle looks like. He's not thinking about God. He says, this was my dream. This is all in a dream. It's amazing. It's a commentary of Shulchan Aruch. And then he says, Ve'izbeinen elav ba'beker. So then I had to think about this, because a dream. A dream could be just a dream. He said, I contemplated this revelation, if you want to call it, this epiphany. Ve'ro'isi kinochanu. I said, yes. Yeah, this is not just a dream. This is not just some kind of vision. No, this is logical. It makes sense. And he says, now we can understand the story in the Gemara with Rabba and Abzeda. So it says, it's a Maisa Lister. If that's the pshat of Adalayada, then the story is the opposite. The halacha is don't get wasted, and in the story they get wasted. So he says, no. What happened really is that you are obligated to go until that point. And what happened with Rabba and Abzeda is they weren't careful with that line. They went past the line. And therefore they came into a state of danger. And what the Gemara is trying to tell you with the story is, make sure you watch the line. Know when to stop. Take l'chaim, know when to stop. Getting wasted is not Purim. Getting tipsy and elevated is Purim. That's Adal Yoda. Now these words of the Yad Ephraim really, really explain the concept, I think, in an extraordinary way.
This is Yad Ephraim, what you mean?
This is the Yad Ephraim. Ephraim Zomar Golos. So here's like the what we have to kind of, here's what we're going to do now. I think I shared with you like the development of this in Halacha. The bottom line is that the Rif, the Rosh, the Rambam, they all say, say the Gemara straight, the way it is. The Korban Nesanel explains the Rosh, he explains the Gemara. When the Rambam says, Ad sheyerdem mishikrusei, so the Hagos Maimonides says like this. He says, the Ravia wrote that this is mitzvah ba'alma v'loy la'akev. It's only for a mitzvah, but it's not really something which in any way is binding. It's a mitzvah, but it's not binding. What does that mean? So I actually looked up the Ravia. It's very interesting. The Ravia is quoted by a number of the Rishonim. That's how they finish off. They quote this Ravia. The Ravia does say that. The Ravia says in Maseches Megillah, in chapter 564, the Ravia says, he's one of the very early Balei HaTosfos. He says, "Mechayev inish lebesumei nafshei." You have to. He uses the word, adds the word nafshei. Adelayoda. You have to, so to speak, achieve elevated consciousness till you don't know the difference between Or Haman and Baruch Mordechai. He said, "V'nira the cholhani tzarich mitzvah ba'alma v'loy la'akov le'ikov." It's a, it's a mitzvah, but it's not binding. So what does that mean? What does that mean? It's a mitzvah but not binding. If it's a mitzvah, it's binding. If it's not a mitzvah, it's not binding. What does a non-binding mitzvah look like? What does that mean? So the answer to that question I found in the Sha'arei Tshuva. The Sha'arei Tshuva, which is another commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says something which really made this whole business snap into sharp, beautiful contrast to me. Here is where it goes HD. He says, if you look in the Siddur Amudei Shamayim, he writes, which is a Siddur with halachas, he writes, Sha'oviv hagoin zal hayanoig b'mei bachurusi l'kayim hamemre kipshute. That when his father was young, a young man, he would literally drink till he fell asleep. He would drink till he was finished. But he says, what if somebody is weak, cholosh b'tivei? Somebody can't drink like that. Or he says, he gets crazy. What happens if you can't handle your booze? Some people can't handle their booze. So he says, if you can't handle your booze, or you're going to do things inappropriately, some people behave very inappropriately when they get drunk. If that's going to happen, he says, Ein loy lishtes yoiser midai. In the Siddur, Amudei Shamayim, he says, then don't drink more. Don't drink too much. And he says, Raya ledover, what's a proof? Riva, Reish Yud Beis Aleph. Veduk. Veduk means look and you'll see. So what does that mean? A proof that you shouldn't drink too much is Riva. What's Riva? Says the Sha'arei Tshuva, I figured it out. I solved the mystery. I cracked the code. I believe what he means is, Riva is Rosh Tevot for Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi. Because there's an amazing Gemara of Rabbi, that tells a story about Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi. It's a Gemara in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the 8th chapter of Shabbat, and right in the beginning, that it says Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi did not make Kiddush on wine. Do you know why? Because he couldn't handle wine. He says he would drink wine one night a year. Only once a year. Leishasi ella me pischa le pischa. He would only drink from one Pesach to the next. And they only had one Seder. Once a year, he would drink 4 cups of wine. And the Gemara goes on to say, V'chugrani tzare, he had pain in his stomach till Shavuot. He would suffer upset stomach for 7 weeks. But he drank wine once a year. Now, what does that sound like? If you drank wine once a year, what does it sound like? He says, Mashma de bePurim lo ishasa. On Purim, he didn't drink wine at all. Why? Because because it hurt him. So why did he drink wine on Pesach night? Because on Pesach night it's a chiyuv. An obligation is an obligation. I have a headache when I hear the shofar. I'm sorry, you have a headache. Take Tylenol. Take Anacin 3. I don't know. You have a headache, you have a headache. We are still obligated to that. When you're obligated to do. So when a person has an obligation, there's no option out. You can't opt out if I don't feel right, or maybe I won't behave right. What happened? When I hear the shofar, I get very depressed. Am I exempt from me listening to the shofar? A guy once came to me and says, I don't wear leather. I don't eat meat. I don't wear leather. Am I exempt from tefillin? I said, no. He said, but I don't do that. It's against my morals. I said, you're a Jew. It can't be against your morals. You don't want to wear leather shoes? Don't wear leather shoes. You have to put on tefillin. When there's a chiyuv, when there's an obligation, it's something we have to do. Simply stated, people say it's a mitzvah to eat meat on Shabbos. It is. It says it's a meal. It's a mitzvah. You should eat meat. And what if a person says, I'm nauseous eating meat. I'm a vegetarian. I can't bear the thought to eat meat. Does he have to eat meat? No. Can't. He can't. What are you going to do? So there are mitzvahs that are obligatory, and mitzvahs that are not. It's a mitzvah to eat Korban Pesach. When Mashiach will come, Eretz Hashem, hopefully this year, Pesach will come and bring a Korban Pesach. Could the vegetarian opt out of the meat? The answer is no. Put a clothespin on your nose and eat the Korban. It's a chiyuv. It's an obligation. Mitzvahs are not elective. Chiyuvim are chiyuvim. Getting drunk is not an obligation. It's a nice thing to do if it's nice. If you get senseless and crazy, then better don't do it. So what is Purim supposed to be about? Drunkenness? Intoxication? Craziness? No. Purim is supposed to be about happiness. Purim is supposed to be about elevated spirituality. That's what Purim is supposed to be about. And wine plays a role, if it can. And what if it can't? What if somebody's an alcoholic? Then don't drink wine. Don't drink anything alcoholic. You're an alcoholic. You're a sickness. You have a sickness you can't drink. And what if this guy drinks and becomes totally meshuggah? That person shouldn't be drinking on Purim at all. So when the Gemara, when the Shulchan Aruch says these things, it says chayiv inish lebesuni adala yada. It doesn't mean literally to get hammered, smashed. It means to drink to a point. And even drink it to a point has to be in a way that is meaningful, not meaningless. The point is not to get senseless in the crazy sense. The point is to be able to lose oneself in the holiness and the magic of the moment. That's the point. So why did we use the language of Adala Yoda ben Or Haman Baruch Mordechai? So if you like, you can follow your gematria approach. The grandfather of the Chidor, Rabba Avrom Azulai, says, you know why they use that language? He meant gematria. So why do you use that language? Why did you say you can't do math? He says, because Mishum Simchas Purim Nakat Derech B'dichusa. This is Hilchas Purim, so we used a humorous thing. Humorously meant to say you can't do math, you can't figure out 502. And it means you have to, says Rabba Avram on his commentary on the Levush, it means a person has to take Eini Ela Mitzvah, Loili Kuva. Here he's saying the words of the Ravia. What does it mean? He says, Afal Pisha Shikra Su Osir, even though drunkenness is prohibited, you have to drink more on Purim. Because all the miracles happen through the Mishnah. They happen through the drinking. So you have to really connect to the spirit of Purim. That enables and helps you to connect to the spirit of Purim. The big question though is, but the story of the Gemara is Rabba shechted Ebzeda. How did that happen? Was not in control of himself? How could that be? Rabba was a perfect tzaddik. How could it be? And if Rabba couldn't control himself, how could any of us control ourselves? So we still have a difficulty with this Gemara, and therefore I'm going to conclude tonight's class with a phenomenal, when should you say the blessing after the meal, before the nap or after, Zalman is asking. Zalman, the answer is it depends when you could say the blessing best. If you, it doesn't, first of all, you don't have to nap. It says if you want to fulfill that, that's one of the ways of doing it. You definitely have to bench. It's not even a question. It says that Amma used to go from his Purim table, he would go walking through town. It was the Rav in Krakow. And he would knock on the doors and make sure that people benched. Whoever forgot to bench should bench. And people have to daven ma'ariv. You have to daven ma'ariv and you have to bench. And the answer is, at a certain point, if you see you're losing it, stop and bench and daven ma'ariv. It doesn't come at that expense. You're not exempt from doing these things. There's an incredible sikha from the Rebbe. It's an edited sikha. It is found in the 31st volume of Likutei Sichos. I had the privilege of being at the sikha as a boy. I heard the sikha from the Rebbe. I was there when the Rebbe said the sikha. It was very, very special. It was Shabbos. I think it was Shushan Purim, if my memory doesn't fail me. If not Shushan Purim, a few days after Purim. It was either Shushan Purim or a few days after Purim. It was a very special farbrengen. Very, very special farbrengen. My maternal grandfather, who usually was at his shul in Flatbush, was there by that farbrengen. My uncle was getting married after the Rebbe told him L'chaim. On a personal level, it was special for me, but it was a very memorable farbrengen. And the next year, the Rebbe edited the sikha. And that's what I want to conclude the class with, because the only question that we never really answered is, so how do we understand the story? Oh, by the way, before I get to that, sorry. One more very, very important little point here. I didn't share with you the pre-Chodesh. This is important. So we have, with these various opinions that stated, that the fact that we get the story is a proof that the Gemara doesn't actually endorse the ruling of Rava. So the pre-Chodesh says, okay, he says, I saw what Rabbeinu Ephraim said. I saw that he said that the Rava's halacha was superseded. And he said, with all due respect, it's just not correct. It's not a correct reading of the Gemara, he says. Ein ze nachon. He says, Im Kain, if that was the case, why is it the next year when Rabba invited Ibn Zera, he said, well, I'd come, but I don't know if a miracle will happen next year again. Why did he say that? Why didn't he say, hey, Rabba, don't you realize that after you went crazy last year, that this halacha is finished? The halacha was superseded? What is ishtamit? He had to kind of twist his way out of it. Weasel his way out, saying, I don't want. Maybe a miracle won't happen. And why wouldn't the Chachamim shut this down? If such a terrible thing happened, the Chachamim should have shut it down. Why did they shut it down? He shouldn't have invited him back. He shouldn't be drinking anymore. So he says, on the contrary, the fact that the Gemara brings this story tells you that Rava's ruling is kipshutei. Rava's ruling was that a person should take l'chaim until he doesn't know the difference in Haman and Baruch Mordechai, and Rabba did it, and look what happened. But that's what happened. So should we do that? So the Pri Chodesh says, look, Ata these days, Hadeiros Mekulkalim, we're a lot weaker than we used to be. We don't have the stamina, the spiritual courage. It's not for us, he says. Now you could just follow Rabbeinu Ephraim. He says, I don't agree with him that the Gemara is superseding the halacha, but just drink a little, he says. Lishtes ma'at, a little more than regular, on a regular Yom Tif. And he says, and you'll fulfill your obligation that way. And the main thing is, he says, your kavanah should be l'shem shamayim, and you don't want to have a stumbling block, and you'll receive blessing from Hashem. Okay. But the problem is, how do you make sense out of the story? So some explain the story in a mystical and a spiritual way, and the Rebbe says that's not tenable. Of course, the Torah can be understood in many, many levels, and I'm sure there's a spiritual story and a beautiful, and it's all fantastic, it's all wonderful. However, the very fact that Rabbeinu Ephraim argues if the halacha is accepted or not accepted for the virtue of the story tells you the story is literal. Does it also have mystical meaning? Sure. But the story has to be literal too. And that brings us back to the question. So what are you going to tell? The Meiri says he didn't shecht him, he just squashed him. Ischit. He squeezed him out. He squeezed the life out of him. He squashed him and then he was sick and then he put him back together. That is normal. Well, Rabbi beat the living daylights out of him. And then he healed him. Shkoyach. Oh, he didn't shecht him. Just beat the crap out of him. Well, what does that even mean? So the Rebbe says an amazing thing, and we're like an hour and 20 minutes into this class, and unfortunately, what I'm going to say is not going to do justice. This is a sikha that deserves a 5-hour class. That's the truth, and maybe Someday we'll go through the Sikha properly. But I'm just going to give you the gist of it to kind of bring it all together. The Rebbe says, yes, it's literal, but this is the key to unlocking the mystery of that story and understanding what happened then and what we're looking for today. The Or HaChaim HaKadosh comments on the sons of Aaron going into the Holy of Holies with their unauthorized incense, and they die. And our sages tell us, Shsuye Yayin, they were drunk. And the Or HaChaim's drunk? What do you mean? Moshe turns around to Aaron and he says, to comfort him, B'krovei HaKodesh, I knew that God was going to take somebody's life in this whole process. It wasn't going to go down quietly. But I thought it was going to be me or you. They are holier than us. What, two drunks? That's a new methodology of holiness? What does it even mean? And you cannot say that so what does it mean? So the Rebbe says, the Or HaChaim explains that Nadav and Avihu had a tremendous yearning and a thirst for divinity. So much so that their souls soared in spiritual ecstasy and simply left their bodies. This is called, in the language of Pnimius HaTorah, it's called Kilois HaNefesh. The soul yearns for Hashem to the point that it can no longer remain in this physical world. What does that have to do with wine? So the Rebbe says that wine is one of the liquids that Torah is metaphorized as, and wine is the part of Torah that releases the deepest secrets of Torah. Just like we say, Nichnas Yayin Yotza, so wine in, secrets out. It looses the inhibitions, it looses the spiritual inhibitions, or the unspiritual inhibitions that don't allow the soul and its imagination to soar. Just like material wine. So you're going to say, oh, so Nadav and Avihu didn't drink wine? The Rebbe says you can't say that, because the very next pasuk in the Torah says, Aaron, one is not permitted to enter into the Beis HaMikdash after you drink wine. So clearly drinking wine is a part of this. How do you understand it? So the Rebbe quotes a phenomenal teaching from the Shalah. He says that it is known that there were great tzaddikim who, in order to be able to share the deepest secrets of Torah, in order to unlock their inner ability of connecting to Hashem in the most profound way, they would drink a lot of wine, and the wine would put the bodily limitations and the lack of imaginative mind expansion to kind of limit that, to put that aside, and then their minds would soar, and they would be able to speak freely. And that's when the deepest secrets of Torah would come out. So it's not divorced from one another. These are two mutual experiences that happen at the same time. A lot of wine, what happens is a lot of alcohol is it's like anesthetic. It's painful for people to express themselves. People are bashful, people are shy, they're inhibited. The wine loosens those inhibitions. But if you're a person of great spirituality, when those inhibitions are loosed, then the true spirituality will come forth. And as Michael David is commenting on the live chat, Fabrengen, exactly. The Shalah is describing of Fabrengen, precisely. So what happened? What happened was that Rabba shared the deepest secrets of Torah with Reb Zera. And Reb Zera was so taken by these secrets of Torah, his soul was so stirred, so inspired, so uplifted, that the soul actually separated from the body. Rabba, the Rebbe said, like his name sounds, was Rav. He had a great, expansive mind. He could handle the spiritual experience, and it didn't overwhelm him. Reb Zera's name means Zeira, small, very humble. Reb Zera couldn't handle it. So Reb Zera's soul soared. So the next year, Rabba invites Reb Zera back. You think that Rabba would invite him back if he beat him back in black and blue? If he slaughtered him, he'd invite him back? And Reb Zera says, nah, I don't want to do that. Reb Zera says, I'm afraid, I know what's going to happen. We're going to sit down. We're going to say L'chaim. And we'll say more wine. And you'll start teaching Kabbalah. And I'm going to start we're going to start to talk about Torah. And we're going to talk about Torah. And I know. My soul is just going to, it's too much for me. And I won't make it. So he says, that's why I'm going to stay put. So what we're really talking about is not getting wasted. We're talking about is spiritual exhilaration. We're talking about higher consciousness. And anybody who cannot experience higher consciousness, real higher consciousness, but he just becomes a mean, vicious drunk, should stay far away from the substance on Purim. That has nothing to do with Purim. Purim is not a holiday of drunkenness. Purim is a holiday of sublime spirituality. And this you can see in the language. It should say, Rabba, shachtel Reb Zera. It says, come, Rabba. What does come mean? Come means he was uplifted. Rabba was uplifted. And the Rebbe says, why shachte? Because the Gemara says, ein v'shachat ela umashach. V'shachat, the slaughter, means really to uplift. That means before, the animal is an animal. But after he gets shechted, meaning he becomes a kosher meat, the animal can be elevated. Like the famous story that's told about one of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim, there was a big farbrengen, and everything was fantastic, but the food ran out. The food ran out, so people started leaving. So he said, don't leave, this is a wonderful farbrengen. I'll bring food, I got food. He had a goat, a little goat. And there was a Hasidic sheichet. He said, go run quickly, get your knife. And there was a Hasidic butcher. He says, go get your stuff. And they shechted the goat. And they barbecued him. And it was a wonderful farbrengen the whole night. And the next morning, the chassid is woken by his wife. I forget the name of the very famous chassid. And she says, somebody stole the goat. He said, nobody stole our goat. Nobody stole our goat. He says, no, I'm telling you, the goat's not there. And he said, last night the goat was saying, this morning the goat will say Shema Yisrael. That means umashach. Umashach means to elevate it. Shecht meat means to elevate meat. That's why we eat meat, not because we're gluttons. Because we believe that we as humanity are uniquely endowed to serve Hashem, and by ingesting the minerals feed the vegetation feed the animals feed the people, and the people are serving Hashem. That's a simplistic but actually overarching view. That's what it is. That's what's going on here. And so, v'shachat doesn't mean he shechted, it means he uplifted. He uplifted Reb Zera. And Reb Zera said, I'm afraid, I know what happens at your Purim Suda. It's too spiritual for me. I'm too weak to be able to experience another Purim like that. And we know, in fact, that the Rebbe was the most pious, observant Jew I could ever imagine. And he did everything exactly like it says in Shulchan Aruch. Every little thing, every tiny nuance of Shulchan Aruch was exactly precisely the way it was. And we know, as a matter of fact, that over the years, there was once, maybe twice, where the Rebbe took an enormous amount of l'chaim on Purim. Purim Tafshin Chai, the Rebbe had a tremendous amount of l'chaim. That's one Purim. The Rebbe led a farbrengen every single year, and they were some of the most memorable, remarkable farbrengens with the Purim farbrengens. And the people weren't crazy and drunk, because that's not actually what this is all about. And that, my dear friends, is customs and conventions and Purim drinking. So it's wasting the material stuff to be able to experience the spiritual stuff. That's really what this is about. Hashem should help us that by learning about Adol Yada, we should reach Adol Yada. We should be privileged in Metz Hashem to experience the greatest Lo Yada, connecting to God in the most profound, sublime way, which is beyond and entirely transcendent of our own minds and limitations. And that's exactly what will happen in Metz Hashem when Mashiach comes. May it be. B'mheira, u'bi'ameinu. Amen. Thank you so much for joining.